In the cramped lawyer's office after their grandmother's funeral, Samantha's siblings tore through the inheritance like vultures, fighting over jewelry and lakeside property. When Samantha quietly asked for only the old Singer sewing machine collecting dust in the attic, their laughter was cruel and cutting. Her brother called her a sentimental fool who would never understand the value of real wealth. Her sister mocked her for choosing worthless junk over their grandmother's treasures. They had no idea that their grandmother, a seamstress who fled Saigon with nothing but the clothes on her back, had spent 50 years guarding a secret hidden inside that machine's wooden base. The night Samantha heard something shift in the hollow compartment beneath the foot pedal, she understood why her grandmother always whispered, "They see with greedy eyes, but you see with a grateful heart." What fortune had been concealed inside ordinary wood for half a century? Why had her grandmother chosen the family outcast to inherit the truth? The conference room of Sterling and Associates smelled of lemon furniture, polish, and old money, its walls paneled in dark mahogany that seemed to swallow the weak October light filtering through the tall windows. Samantha sat perfectly still in the stiff leather chair, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the 3 days since Grandmother May's funeral. Across the polished table, her brother Derek leaned forward with the hungry intensity of a man who had been waiting for this moment, his expensive suit pulling tight across his shoulders, while their sister Victoria sat beside him, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm on the mahogany surface. Mr. Sterling, the estate attorney, was a thin man in his 60s whose face held the practiced neutrality of someone who had witnessed family ugliness for decades, and he cleared his throat before beginning to read from the thick document before him. The assets were substantial: a lakeside cabin in the mountains worth $800,000, a collection of vintage jewelry appraised at $75,000, stock portfolios, savings bonds, and a modest pension. With each item, Sterling announced, Derek and Victoria's voices rose in a discordant symphony of greed, arguing over who deserved what, who had visited more often, who had sacrificed more, their words sharp and cutting in the sterile air. Derek claimed the cabin should be his because he had a family and needed the space, while Victoria insisted she deserved the jewelry because she was the only daughter of May's successful son and had always appreciated fine things. Their grandmother had been in the ground for 72 hours, and already they were tearing apart her life's accumulation like vultures over a carcass. Samantha said nothing, her throat tight with a grief that felt too large and too private to share in this cold room with these people who had barely visited May in her final years, who had been too busy with their important lives to sit with an old woman who smelled of tiger balm and jasmine tea. When Sterling finally paused in his reading and asked if Samantha had any requests, she spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear in the sudden silence. She asked for only one thing: the old Singer sewing machine that sat in the corner of May's attic, the black cast-iron machine with the ornate gold scrollwork and the wooden base worn smooth by decades of use. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Derek threw his head back and laughed, a loud barking sound that held no warmth, while Victoria's face twisted into an expression of contemptuous disbelief. Derek called her a sentimental fool who had always been soft in the head, who chose worthless emotional attachments over real value, who would probably die poor and alone just like their mother had. Victoria's voice was even crueler, dripping with the particular venom that only a sister can produce, saying that Samantha had always been the charity case of the family, the one they pitied, the social worker who could barely pay rent in her sad little studio apartment, and of course she would choose a piece of junk over something actually worth money. Sterling looked deeply uncomfortable, his weathered face flushing as he made a note in his ledger, processing Samantha's request with a small nod that held something like sympathy. Samantha stood slowly, gathering her worn cloth purse, and walked out of the conference room with her siblings' laughter echoing behind her like the cawing of crows, their mockery following her down the elevator and out into the gray afternoon where the first cold rain of autumn had begun to fall. The sewing machine was far heavier than Samantha remembered, a solid mass of cast iron and wood that seemed to contain within it the weight of decades and memory itself. She carried it from her battered 1998 Honda Civic, the only possession from the estate she had claimed, gripping the wooden base with both hands as she navigated the cracked concrete path to her apartment building. The structure was a faded brick walk-up in a neighborhood that had seen better days, where the bodega on the corner had bars on the windows and the streetlights flickered uncertainly after dark. She lived on the 3rd floor, and there was no elevator, just a narrow stairwell that smelled of cooking spices and old carpet. By the second landing, her arms were burning, her shoulders screaming in protest, but she refused to set the machine down, refused to rest, driven by something she couldn't quite name. Her studio apartment was small, barely 400 square feet, with a kitchenette separated from the main room by a short breakfast bar, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a single window that looked out onto the fire escape and the brick wall of the building next door. The rent was $1,200 a month, nearly half her take-home pay as a social worker for the city's Department of Family Services, and her student loans, the crushing $58,000 she still owed from her master's degree, took another chunk that left her eating ramen more often than she cared to admit. But it was hers, and it was clean, and it was quiet, and right now that was enough. She cleared the small kitchen table, pushing aside the stack of case files she had been reviewing and the half-eaten container of leftover pad thai, and carefully set the Singer machine down on the scarred formica surface. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing hard from the exertion, staring at the machine as the afternoon light slanted through her window and touched the ornate gold scrollwork on the black iron. Then she pulled out one of her two mismatched chairs and sat down, reaching out to run her hands over the wooden base. The wood was smooth and warm beneath her fingers, worn to a soft patina by decades of use, and she noticed for the first time how the color was uneven, darker in some places where her grandmother's hands had rested most often, lighter in others. She traced the grain, feeling the slight indentations and imperfections, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, standing on a step stool in her grandmother's small sewing room, watching May's patient hands guide fabric beneath the rapid needle. May had always smelled of jasmine and the faint medicinal sharpness of tiger balm, and her hands had been strong despite their age, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of work. She had taught Samantha to sew simple stitches, to thread the machine, to respect the tool that had fed her family and kept a roof over their heads. Samantha leaned closer to the machine and breathed in, and the scent transported her instantly across time. The sharp, clean smell of machine oil mixed with the musty sweetness of old fabric, of thread and dust and history. She closed her eyes and let the grief she had been holding back in Sterling's cold conference room finally surface, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she sat alone in her tiny apartment with the only inheritance that mattered, the only piece of her grandmother that her siblings had been too blind and too greedy to value. Outside, the city rumbled and honked and lived its indifferent life, but here, in this small, quiet space, Samantha felt closer to May than she had in the hospital room where her grandmother had taken her last breath, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen exactly right. At 2 a.m, Samantha lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, sleep as distant and unreachable as the stars she couldn't see beyond the city's light pollution. The grief sat on her chest like a physical weight, and every time she closed her eyes she saw her grandmother's face, heard her siblings' cruel laughter, felt the echo of a loneliness so profound it seemed to have no bottom. Finally, she gave up the pretense of rest and rose, padding across the cold floor in her oversized sleep shirt and thick socks, clicking on the small lamp by the kitchen table. The Singer machine sat exactly where she had left it, a silent monument of black iron and worn wood, and on impulse she decided to see if it still worked. She had no fabric, no thread, no real purpose except the need to hear the mechanical rhythm that had been the soundtrack of her childhood visits to May's house. She located the power cord coiled beneath the base, plugged it into the wall outlet, and gently pressed the foot pedal. The machine hummed to life, the familiar whir of the motor filling her small apartment, but beneath that expected sound was something else, something wrong, a distinct rattling, a loose, irregular noise that seemed to come not from the mechanical parts but from deeper within the wooden base itself. Samantha released the pedal immediately, frowning, her heart rate picking up slightly as she leaned closer. She pressed the pedal again, lighter this time, and there it was, rattle, rattle, shift. It was not the sound of loose screws or worn gears. It was the sound of something moving freely inside a hollow space, something that had weight and substance. Her hands were suddenly unsteady as she unplugged the machine and carefully tilted it to one side. The rattling became more pronounced, a definite shifting sensation, like objects sliding from one side of a container to another, and Samantha's pulse began to hammer in her throat. She set the machine back down and knelt beside the table, bringing her face level with the base, examining it with an intensity she usually reserved for reading court documents on her most difficult child welfare cases. The wooden base was approximately 6 inches tall, constructed of dark walnut or mahogany, with decorative carved details along the edges that she had always assumed were purely ornamental. She ran her fingers along every surface, pressing and probing, and that was when she noticed something peculiar. Tiny irregularities in the wood grain on the bottom panel. Places where the veneer seemed slightly raised, almost imperceptible bumps that her fingertips caught. Her heart was racing now, her mind spinning with possibilities she didn't want to name. She retrieved her small toolbox from the closet, a modest collection of tools she had assembled over years of apartment living and furniture assembly, and selected a flathead screwdriver. Under the bright light of her desk lamp, positioned to illuminate the underside of the base, she carefully worked the tip of the screwdriver beneath the edge of what she now realized was a thin, decorative veneer strip. It lifted easily, peeling back like old wallpaper, and beneath it were 4 Phillips head screws, their metal darkened with age, positioned at the corners of what appeared to be a removable panel. These screws had been deliberately hidden, camouflaged by the decorative wood overlay, designed to be invisible to any casual observer. Samantha sat back on her heels, breathing hard, staring at her grandmother's sewing machine as if seeing it for the first time, and in the silent apartment at 2:30 in the morning, with the hidden screws gleaming dully in the lamplight, she understood that May had left her more than a sentimental keepsake, more than a relic of the past. She had left her a secret that was meant only for Samantha's eyes. With trembling hands that she couldn't seem to steady no matter how hard she tried, Samantha retrieved her Phillips head screwdriver from the toolbox and positioned herself on the floor beneath the overturned sewing machine, her neck bent at an awkward angle as she worked. The screws were old but not rusted, and they turned smoothly, as if they had been removed and replaced many times over the years. She placed each screw carefully in a small dish beside her, counting them out of habit, a nervous gesture from a mind trying to process something it didn't yet understand. When the 4th screw came free, she set down the screwdriver and gripped the edges of the wooden panel. It lifted away easily, hinged on one side with small brass fittings that had been invisible from the outside, and Samantha found herself staring into a hollow cavity approximately 5 inches deep that had been expertly carved into the solid base of the machine. Nestled inside, fitted so precisely that there was barely a 1/4 inch of clearance on any side, was a metal box. It was dark green, military in appearance, with reinforced corners and a rubber gasket seal running along the seam where the lid met the body. The surface was unmarred by rust or corrosion, and when Samantha carefully lifted it from its hiding place, she was surprised by its substantial weight, easily 10 or 12 pounds. The metal was cold against her palms, and she could see manufacturer stamps on the side indicating it was designed to be airtight and waterproof. The kind of container used to protect sensitive documents or equipment in harsh conditions, but it was what rested on top of the box that made Samantha's breath catch in her throat and tears spring instantly to her eyes. An envelope, the cheap white kind sold in packs at drugstores, was affixed to the lid with a piece of clear packing tape that had yellowed slightly with time. Written across the front in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, the careful script of someone who had learned English as a second language and took pride in forming each letter with precision, were the words, "To my Samantha, who always saw with her heart." Samantha's hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped the box. She set it down on the kitchen table with exaggerated care and sank into the chair, staring at her name written in May's hand. The envelope was sealed, and in the upper right corner, where a stamp would normally go, her grandmother had written a date, April 3rd, just 6 months ago. 6 months ago, May had been alive, had been living in her small house with the garden full of herbs and vegetables, had been moving through the world with the quiet determination that had defined her entire life. But 6 months ago, May had also been sick, the cancer already spreading through her body, though she had told no one, had refused treatment, had simply continued her daily routines with the same patient acceptance she brought to everything. Samantha realized with a jolt that made her stomach clench that her grandmother had known she was dying. May had known, and she had prepared this moment with the same meticulous care she had brought to every aspect of her life. She had written this letter, sealed this box, hidden it in the one possession she knew Samantha would claim, the one item Derek and Victoria would mock and dismiss as worthless. The calculation of it, the foresight, the absolute certainty that Samantha would be the one to find it, spoke to a level of planning that went far beyond a simple inheritance. This was not a last-minute decision or a sentimental gesture. This was deliberate, purposeful, A message across time from a woman who had spent her entire life keeping secrets and bearing burdens alone, and now, in death, had chosen to pass that burden to the one person she trusted completely. Samantha's fingers were clumsy with emotion as she carefully peeled the yellowed tape from the envelope and extracted 2 sheets of thin paper, the kind May had always used for her infrequent letters, covered front and back with her grandmother's precise handwriting. She unfolded them slowly, almost reverently, and began to read through a veil of tears that blurred the words and made her wipe her eyes repeatedly with the back of her hand. "My dearest Samantha," the letter began, and even on paper May's voice came through clear and strong, the formal English of someone who had learned the language late but mastered it through sheer determination. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found what I have protected for 50 years. You must understand the truth of who I was before I became the grandmother you knew, before I became May, the seamstress who lived quietly in a small house and asked for nothing." The letter went on to describe a life Samantha had never known, a world that seemed impossible to reconcile with the gentle old woman who had made her soup when she was sick and taught her to sew straight seams. May had been born Nguyen Thi Mai in Saigon in 1958, the youngest daughter of Nguyen Van Thieu, one of the wealthiest diamond merchants in Southeast Asia, a man who supplied gems to French colonial officials and later to wealthy Vietnamese families and international traders. She wrote of a childhood of privilege in a large house with servants, of French tutors and the finest schools, of a father who doted on his 3 daughters and 2 sons but recognized in young Mai a particular strength and discretion that her siblings lacked. "My father trusted me with things he told no one else," May wrote, "because even as a child I understood the value of silence. I understood that words once spoken could never be taken back, and that in a country at war, silence was the difference between life and death." The letter described the fall of Saigon in April 1975, when May was only 17 years old. As the North Vietnamese forces closed in on the city and chaos erupted in the streets, her father had made a terrible calculation. The family could not all escape together without drawing attention, without being stopped, without having everything seized by the soldiers who were searching everyone fleeing the city. He gathered his children in the middle of the night and made his choice. May's 2 brothers would try to escape by boat. Her 2 sisters would go with their mother on a refugee flight if they could secure papers. But Mai, his youngest and most trusted, would carry the family's entire fortune in the one way no one would suspect. "What I carried out of Vietnam was not sewn into clothing, as so many desperate people did," May wrote, and Samantha could almost hear her grandmother's voice speaking the words aloud. It was not hidden in suitcases that could be searched or confiscated. "I carried it in the one thing no communist soldier would think to steal, the one possession that marked me as a poor working woman beneath their notice. I carried it in the base of my sewing machine, the Singer my father bought me when I turned 16, the machine every young woman of any class might own, and I walked through the checkpoints with my head down, with my papers declaring me an orphaned seamstress seeking passage to America, and no one looked twice." The letter explained that May's entire family had perished in the chaos. Her brother's boat had capsized. Her mother and sisters never made it to the airport. Only May survived, carrying the fortune her father had entrusted to her, a fortune she never touched because it was soaked in the blood of everyone she had loved. The final paragraph was simple and direct. "The box opens with a combination lock. The numbers are my wedding date, the day I married your grandfather and found a reason to keep living. Use what is inside to build something that cannot be stolen, cannot be burned, cannot be lost to war or greed." Samantha set the letter aside with hands that could barely hold the paper steady and turned her attention to the military-grade metal box, her heart hammering so violently she could feel her pulse in her throat. The combination lock was a simple rotating dial mechanism on the front, the kind that required a 4-digit code, and she spun it carefully to May's wedding date. The numbers she had memorized from childhood stories, 06 to 12, June 12, 1978. The day her grandmother had married a kind American engineer named Robert Chen, who had died of a heart attack when Samantha was only 3. The lock clicked open with a soft mechanical sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent apartment, and Samantha lifted the lid with trembling fingers. Inside, the box was lined with foam padding cut into precise compartments, and nestled in those compartments were dozens of small leather pouches, each one darkened with age, each one tied closed with a thin leather cord. Samantha reached for the first pouch with a sense of unreality, as if she were moving through a dream, and loosened the cord with fingers that felt clumsy and disconnected from her body. She tilted the pouch over her open palm, and what spilled out stopped her breath entirely. Diamonds. Not polished, not cut into the brilliant shapes she associated with jewelry, but raw and uncut, their surfaces rough and crystalline, catching the light from her desk lamp and throwing back fractures of rainbow brilliance. There were perhaps 8 or 10 stones in that single pouch, ranging in size from a pea to a marble, and even in their rough state, even to Samantha's completely untrained eye, they were unmistakably real, heavy with a density that cheap glass could never replicate. Her hands shook so badly that 2 of the diamonds rolled off her palm and bounced on the kitchen table, and she had to grab them before they fell to the floor, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She opened another pouch, then another, and each one was the same. Diamonds, some clear, some with a faint yellow or brown tint, all rough and ancient, all glittering with that particular fire that only genuine stones possessed. But it was not just diamonds. The 4th pouch she opened revealed rubies, deep red stones that glowed like drops of blood in the lamplight. The 5th held sapphires, their blue so intense it seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The 6th contained emeralds, green and mysterious and impossibly beautiful. Samantha's mind could not process what she was seeing, could not assign value or meaning to the small fortune spread across her cheap formica table in her tiny studio apartment at 3 in the morning. She forced herself to look deeper into the box, past the pouches, and found another compartment beneath. This section contained papers, documents yellowed with age and protected in clear plastic sleeves. She lifted them out carefully, and found herself looking at bonds and stock certificates printed in French, issued by colonial companies that had operated in Indochina before the fall, ornate documents with elaborate borders and official seals. The names meant nothing to her, but the denominations were clear. 100,000 francs, 50,000 francs, bearer bonds that could be redeemed by whoever held them. In a final envelope at the very bottom of the box was a single sheet of heavy paper, an official deed printed in both Vietnamese and French, dated 1964, declaring ownership of a property on Dong Khoi Street, in what was now Ho Chi Minh City's District 1, the most expensive real estate in all of Vietnam. Samantha's vision was blurring, her breath coming too fast, and she grabbed the continuation of May's letter that she had set aside and read through tears. My father's entire fortune, saved from the communists. I was 17 and terrified. I never spent it because it was paid for with the lives of everyone I loved. I waited for the right hands, and those hands are yours. Samantha spent the next 3 sleepless days researching, her laptop open on her kitchen table surrounded by the leather pouches she had carefully inventoried and photographed, too terrified to leave them in her apartment but equally terrified to carry them with her. She had returned everything to the metal box and hidden it in the back of her closet behind her winter coats, but she had kept one stone, a single diamond that seemed neither the largest nor the smallest, tucked into a small Ziploc bag in her purse. At work, she had confided in her supervisor, Maria Rodriguez, a woman in her 50s who had worked in social services for 3 decades and had seen every variety of human situation imaginable. Maria had listened to Samantha's carefully vague story about inheriting jewelry from her grandmother and needing a trustworthy appraiser, and without asking questions, she had written down a name and address on a post-it note: Samuel Katz, Fine Gems and Estate Jewelry. An address in a respectable part of the city known for antique shops and established businesses. Samantha had taken a half-day off work, claiming a medical appointment, and now she stood outside a narrow storefront with a discreet sign and bars on the windows. Her heart was pounding as she pushed open the door, triggering a soft bell that announced her arrival. The shop was small and dimly lit, with locked glass cases displaying estate jewelry and a workbench visible through a doorway at the back. An elderly man emerged from that back room, perhaps in his 70s, with a deeply lined face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful movements of someone whose hands were his livelihood. He introduced himself as Samuel Katz and asked how he could help her with a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins. Samantha's mouth was dry as she reached into her purse and withdrew the Ziploc bag, placing it on the glass counter between them. Samuel picked it up, held it to the light, and his entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened behind his glasses, and he looked at Samantha with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. He asked if he could examine it properly, and when she nodded, he carried it to his workbench, switching on a bright magnifying lamp and retrieving a series of instruments from a drawer. Samantha watched in silence as he tested the stone with various tools, measuring its dimensions with digital calipers, examining it under magnification, placing it on a small electronic scale. The testing took nearly 20 minutes, and the silence was broken only by his occasional soft murmurs in what might have been Yiddish. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression that was equal parts awe and concern. "This is a flawless 6-carat stone," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of professional expertise. "Where did you get this?" Samantha's prepared answer came out as barely a whisper. It was her grandmother's. Samuel nodded slowly, setting the stone down on a velvet pad and removing his glasses to clean them with a soft cloth, a gesture that seemed designed to give him time to think. "Vietnamese diamonds from before the war," he said, more to himself than to her. "The clarity is extraordinary. The color grading is D, completely colorless. The cut is rough, unfinished, but the raw material is essentially perfect." He paused, putting his glasses back on and looking directly at Samantha. "This stone alone, properly cut and certified, is worth nearly $2 million. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Samantha's feet, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. $2 million for one stone, and she had dozens. Samantha left Samuel Katz's shop in a daze, the diamond once again sealed in its Ziploc bag and buried in her purse, her mind spinning with numbers she couldn't comprehend and implications she couldn't process. $2 million for a single stone, and there were at least 60 or 70 more in those leather pouches, plus the rubies, sapphires, and emeralds she hadn't even begun to have appraised. She walked for blocks without seeing where she was going, her body moving on autopilot, while her mind tried and failed to grasp the magnitude of what her grandmother had left her. By the time she reached her apartment building, the shock had transformed into something else, a desperate, overwhelming need to talk to someone, to share this impossible burden with another human being before it crushed her completely. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs and locked herself in her studio, and without thinking through the consequences, without considering anything beyond her immediate emotional need, she pulled out her phone and called Rachel Martinez. Rachel had been her roommate at college, her closest friend through graduate school, the person who had held her hand through her grandmother's funeral just days ago. They spoke at least twice a week, shared everything, had been each other's support system through failed relationships and career struggles, and the general grinding difficulty of being young women trying to make it in an expensive city. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, asking how Samantha was holding up after the funeral and the awful scene with her siblings at the lawyer's office. Samantha's carefully constructed composure shattered, and the words came pouring out in a torrent she couldn't control. She told Rachel everything: the sewing machine, the hidden compartment, the letter from May describing a life Samantha had never known, the metal box filled with gemstones, the appraiser's shocking valuation. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes straight, her voice rising and falling with emotion, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing at the sheer insanity of it all. And Rachel listened with the perfect mixture of concern and excitement that made Samantha remember why this friendship had endured for over a decade. Rachel asked careful questions, expressed appropriate shock, and promised without hesitation that she would help Samantha figure out what to do next, how to handle something this enormous. She swore on their friendship that she would tell absolutely no one, that this secret was safe with her, and Samantha felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. They talked for another 10 minutes about practical matters, about lawyers and appraisers and safety deposit boxes, and when they finally hung up, Samantha felt lighter, less alone, as if sharing the burden had made it manageable. What Samantha didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Rachel was not alone in her apartment. Her boyfriend Marcus was in the kitchen, supposedly making dinner, but the walls in Rachel's building were thin, and Marcus had excellent hearing. He had caught fragments at first, just enough to make him pause and listen more carefully, and then he had moved closer to the living room doorway, standing perfectly still with a container of leftovers forgotten in his hands. Marcus Chen was 32 years old, a former financial analyst who had lost his job 18 months ago and had been unable to find comparable work since. He had not told Rachel the full truth about his situation, had not mentioned the gambling that had started as a way to blow off steam and had metastasized into a devastating addiction. He owed $48,000 to people who were not patient, who had made it very clear what would happen if he didn't pay, and he had been lying awake at night trying to figure out how to come up with that kind of money before the deadline they had given him. And now, standing in Rachel's kitchen, he had just heard her sweet, naive friend, describe a fortune in untraceable gemstones sitting in a closet in a third-floor walk-up with no security system. Marcus very carefully set down the leftovers and pulled out his phone. 2 days passed in a fog of anxiety, during which Samantha barely slept and jumped at every sound in the hallway outside her apartment. She had moved the metal box from her closet to under her bed, then back to the closet, then finally to a high cabinet above her refrigerator, unable to decide where it would be safest. She had called in sick to work, unable to face her caseload while her mind spun in circles trying to figure out what to do next, how to protect what May had entrusted to her. It was Wednesday afternoon, gray and cold outside her window, when her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. The message contained no greeting, no introduction, just a simple statement that made her blood turn to ice. "We know about the stones. Sell them to us, or everyone will know what you have." Samantha stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, her hands beginning to shake so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She tried to call the number back, but it went straight to an automated message saying the subscriber could not be reached. She sat on her bed, her heart pounding, trying to think logically through the rising panic. Who could possibly know? She had told only Rachel, and Rachel would never betray her, would never share something told in such strict confidence. But someone knew, and that someone was threatening her, and the implication was clear. Sell the stones to them at whatever price they demanded, or they would spread the word that she had a fortune in her apartment, and she would become a target for every desperate person in the city. She tried calling Rachel, needing to hear her friend's voice, needing reassurance and help, but the call went to voicemail. She tried again an hour later, and then again that evening, leaving increasingly worried messages that went unanswered. Rachel always answered her calls, always called back within minutes, and the silence was almost as terrifying as the threatening text. As night fell and the shadows in her apartment grew long, Samantha moved through her small space, checking the locks on her door and window repeatedly, her body thrumming with an anxiety that bordered on panic. She tried to eat dinner but managed only a few bites before her stomach rebelled. She turned on the television for noise, for the illusion of company, but couldn't focus on anything playing on the screen. At just past midnight, when she was lying in bed with her eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, she heard it, the distinctive sound of someone trying her doorknob. It was quiet, careful, the sound of someone testing to see if the door was locked, rather than someone legitimately trying to enter their own apartment. Samantha's breath froze in her lungs. She heard the knob rattle again, then the sound of something scraping against the lock, metal on metal. Someone was trying to pick it. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, whispering urgently to the dispatcher that someone was trying to break into her apartment. The operator kept her on the line, her voice calm and professional, saying officers were on the way, and Samantha heard footsteps in the hallway, heard them retreat rapidly down the stairs. By the time 2 police officers arrived 8 minutes later, whoever had been at her door was long gone. The officers were professional but skeptical, a young woman and an older man who looked like they had seen this exact situation 100 times before. They checked the hallway, examined her door for signs of tampering, and found faint scratches around the lock that could have been fresh or could have been years old. The older officer, whose nameplate read Martinez, told her it was likely a random break-in attempt, that this neighborhood had been having problems with opportunistic thieves checking doors in the middle of the night. But Samantha knew better, knew with absolute certainty that this was connected to the text message, connected to the stones, connected to her catastrophic mistake in trusting that her secret would remain safe. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, Samantha made a decision born of desperation and instinct. She left her apartment, carrying only her purse with the single appraised diamond still inside, took 2 different buses in directions she didn't need to go, and finally made her way to her grandmother's old neighborhood, a quiet street of small post-war houses where May had lived for 35 years. The house itself was still tied up in the estate process, empty and silent behind its chain-link fence. But next door was the tidy blue bungalow where Mrs. Chen had lived for 4 decades, and Samantha found herself standing on that familiar porch, pressing the doorbell with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Mrs. Chen answered after a moment, a small, elegant woman in her late 70s with snow-white hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She took one look at Samantha's face and said simply, "Come in, child. You look like someone running from ghosts." Inside, The house smelled of jasmine tea and something baking, and Mrs. Chen guided Samantha to a comfortable chair in the small, immaculately kept living room before disappearing into the kitchen. She returned with a pot of tea and 2 delicate cups, poured for both of them, and sat down in the chair opposite Samantha with the patient stillness of someone who knew that rushing would only make the telling harder. Samantha's story came out in fragments at first, then in a flood, and Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, her expression never changing from one of calm, knowing attention. When Samantha finally finished, breathless and crying, Mrs. Chen set down her teacup and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of her own history. "Your grandmother spoke of you often in the last years," she said. "She told me you had her father's spirit, humble but unbreakable. She said you were the only one in the family who understood that the value of something was not in what it cost, but in what it meant." Mrs. Chen paused, looking out the window toward May's empty house, and her voice grew softer. "May and I were friends for many years. We understood each other in ways native-born Americans never could. We both left everything behind, carried pieces of our old lives in our hands and hearts. One night, perhaps 10 years ago, we sat in my garden drinking wine, and she told me something I never forgot. She said she was carrying the weight of the old country, that she had brought something precious out of the war, and that someday she would have to decide what to do with it." Mrs. Chen turned back to Samantha, and her eyes were fierce with conviction. "She chose you, and that was not an accident. Your brother and sister have your father's greed, but you have May's heart. Now you must be smart. You need a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. You need someone who specializes in international estate recovery, someone who understands refugee assets and how to protect them legally. These situations are more common than you think, and there are people who know how to handle them properly." She reached across the small space between their chairs and gripped Samantha's hand with surprising strength. "And listen to me carefully. Trust no one from your family. I watched your brother and sister at the funeral. I saw how they looked at May's things, how they calculated value instead of feeling loss. If they learn what you have, they will tear you apart to get it. They are vultures, and vultures do not change their nature." Mrs. Chen released her hand and stood, moving to a small desk in the corner where she wrote something on a piece of paper. "This is the name of a lawyer, David Zhang. He helped my cousin with something similar many years ago. Call him, tell him Mrs. Chen from Mei Nguyen's neighborhood sent you, and he will understand." Marcus Chen sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the apartment he shared with Rachel, staring at the business card he had found online for Derek Callahan, investment banker, and feeling the cold sweat of desperation on his palms. The men he owed money to had called again that morning, their voices polite but carrying the unmistakable edge of finality, saying they would need the $48,000 by Friday, or they would have no choice but to take alternative measures, and Marcus knew exactly what that meant. He had spent 2 sleepless nights weighing his options, and had concluded he had none, so he made the call, his voice steady despite his shaking hands, as he explained to Derek that he had information about assets Derek's grandmother had left that Derek might be interested in. Valuable assets that Derek's sister Samantha was currently hiding. Derek had been skeptical at first, his tone dismissive, but when Marcus mentioned diamonds and gemstones worth millions, the tone changed instantly to sharp, focused attention. They met an hour later in a parking garage, and Marcus told him everything he had overheard, every detail Rachel had shared with Samantha, and Derek pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check for $10,000 with the cold efficiency of a man who understood the value of information. The moment Derek's car pulled out of the garage, he was on the phone with Victoria, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, explaining that their pathetic cousin had been sitting on a fortune, that May had hidden millions in that worthless sewing machine, and that Samantha had been planning to keep it all for herself. Victoria's response was immediate and vicious, saying she had always known Samantha was conniving beneath that meek exterior, and they agreed to meet at Samantha's apartment within the hour. Samantha was sitting at her kitchen table with the contact information Mrs. Chen had given her, trying to summon the courage to call the lawyer, when the pounding started on her door. It was not a knock, but an assault, Derek's fist hammering against the wood with enough force to make the frame rattle, his voice booming through the thin door demanding she open it immediately. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, and the pounding intensified until she was afraid the neighbors would call the police or that Derek would simply break the door down. She unlocked it with trembling hands, and Derek pushed past her before she could speak. Victoria following close behind, and suddenly her small studio felt impossibly cramped with their presence, their expensive clothes and their rage filling the space like a toxic cloud. Derek's face was red, his eyes blazing with an anger she had never seen before, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries or pretense. He demanded she hand over everything, every stone, every document, every piece of what May had left, claiming it rightfully belonged to the whole family, and that her attempt to keep it for herself was theft. Pure and simple, Samantha found her voice and said no, said that May had left the machine to her specifically, that the will was clear, but Victoria cut her off with a laugh that was more like a snarl. Victoria stepped closer, her perfectly made-up face twisted with contempt, and her voice dripped with venom as she spoke. You think you deserve this? You think you're worthy of millions when you're nothing but a bleeding-heart social worker who can barely pay rent in this pathetic little apartment? You're a joke, Samantha. And if you don't hand over what belongs to us, we'll bury you in legal fees until you lose everything and end up even more pathetic than you already are. Derek nodded, his arms crossed, and said they would contest the will, claim May was mentally incompetent, drag this through court for years, and Samantha would spend every penny she might eventually get just trying to defend herself. Within 48 hours of the confrontation in her apartment, Samantha received a thick envelope from a law firm she had never heard of, Morrison and Associates, delivered by a process server who found her at work and handed her the papers in front of 3 of her colleagues and the receptionist. Inside was an emergency motion filed with the probate court by Derek Callahan and Victoria Callahan Pierce, petitioning to immediately freeze all assets of May Nguyen's estate pending a full investigation into the contents of the singer's sewing machine and what they called significant undisclosed assets that were deliberately hidden from the probate process. The legal language was dense and aggressive, claiming that the sewing machine and its contents represented a substantial portion of May's estate that had not been properly inventoried or disclosed to all heirs, and that Samantha had engaged in a pattern of deceptive conduct designed to deprive Derek and Victoria of their rightful inheritance. Attached to the motion were affidavits from Derek and Victoria swearing that May had shown signs of dementia in her final years, that she had been confused and forgetful, and that any letter she might have written could not be considered a legally binding expression of intent. Their attorney, a man named Richard Morrison, whose biography on the firm's website described him as specializing in aggressive estate litigation, had filed the motion with enough supporting documentation to make it look credible, and a hearing was scheduled for the following week. Samantha sat in her car in the parking lot outside her office building and cried until she couldn't breathe, the papers crumpled in her hands, the weight of it all crushing her. That evening, with Mrs. Chen sitting beside her for moral support, she called the number on the paper Mrs. Chen had given her and reached David Zhang. His voice was calm and professional, with the faint trace of an accent that suggested he too was first generation, and when Samantha explained her situation in halting, tearful sentences, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause, and then David asked her a single question. Did she have her grandmother's letter? When she said yes, he asked her to bring everything to his office the next morning, and something in his voice, a certainty and steadiness, made her believe for the first time since this nightmare began that she might not be facing it alone. David Zhang's office was in a modest building in Chinatown, 3 rooms on the 2nd floor above a restaurant, and when Samantha arrived with Mrs. Chen, David greeted them both with a respectful bow. He was perhaps 45, with kind eyes and an understated confidence in his manner, and he listened to Samantha's full story while taking careful notes. When she handed him May's letter and showed him photographs of the stones and documents, his expression shifted from professional interest to something deeper, something personal. He told her that his own parents had fled China in 1989 with nothing but the jewelry his mother wore hidden beneath her clothes, and that he had built his practice specifically to help families like theirs, families who had escaped wars and revolutions carrying whatever pieces of their former lives they could save. He said that cases like May's were more common than most people realized, that there were thousands of refugees who had hidden wealth in ingenious ways and had lived quiet lives while sitting on fortunes, too traumatized to use them, waiting for the right moment that sometimes never came. He explained that refugee assets were protected under specific legal frameworks, and that May's letter, combined with the clear designation in the will that Samantha inherited the sewing machine and everything upon it, created a strong legal foundation for her claim. David Zhang was methodical and thorough, and over the next 2 weeks, he assembled a portrait of May's life that was far more complete than anything Samantha had ever known. He started with immigration records, sending formal requests to the National Archives and the State Department, and within days he had May's original entry documents from 1975. Yellowed pages that showed a terrified 17-year-old girl photographed at a refugee processing center in the Philippines, her eyes hollow with shock and loss. He found her initial asylum application, where she had listed her occupation as seamstress and her possessions as 1 suitcase and 1 sewing machine, and he found the records of her first years in America, living in a refugee hostel in California, working in a garment factory for minimum wage, sending every spare dollar to the Red Cross in hopes of finding her family. But David's real breakthrough came when he hired a researcher in Vietnam who specialized in pre-war business records, a woman who had connections to old French colonial archives that had somehow survived the war. What she found was remarkable. Nguyen Van Thieu had been one of the most prominent gem merchants in Southeast Asia, a man who had built his fortune in the 1950s and 60s by serving as a middleman between the diamond mines of Burma and Cambodia and the wealthy French colonial officials who wanted the finest stones for their wives and mistresses. There were shipping manifests showing regular deliveries of uncut gems, business licenses from the South Vietnamese government, even a faded photograph from a Saigon newspaper in 1968 showing Nguyen Van Thieu at a charity gala, a distinguished man in a white dinner jacket standing beside his elegant wife and 5 children, the youngest of whom was clearly May. David also found the flight manifest that changed everything, a document he had to request through channels in the Philippines where many refugee flights had been processed. It was a passenger list from an Air America flight that left Tan Son Nhut Airport on April 28, 1975, 2 days before the fall of Saigon. And on that list was the name May Nguyen, age 17, along with a notation of her declared possessions, 1 suitcase, 1 Singer sewing machine. The fact that a teenage girl fleeing a collapsing city had insisted on bringing a heavy sewing machine had been unusual enough that someone had made a note of it in the manifest records, calling it occupational equipment that she had been allowed to bring because she was traveling alone and had proved she was a trained seamstress. But the most heartbreaking discovery came when David's Vietnamese researcher searched through the scattered death records and refugee databases that had been compiled in the years after the war. She found the names of May's entire family on various lists of those who had perished in April and May of 1975. Her 2 brothers, Duc and Than, had died when their boat capsized trying to reach an American naval vessel. Her 2 sisters, Lan and Huang, and her mother had died in a stampede at the airport when thousands of desperate people tried to force their way onto the last flights out. Her father, Nguyen Van Thieu, had been found dead of a heart attack in his ransacked home by North Vietnamese soldiers who entered Saigon on April 30th. May was the sole survivor of her entire family, a 17-year-old girl carrying a fortune that represented everyone she had ever loved, every person who had died while she escaped. When David presented these findings to Samantha in his office, laying out the documents one by one, Samantha finally understood why her grandmother had lived such a modest life despite sitting on millions, why she had worked herself to exhaustion sewing clothes for other people, why she had never spoken of Vietnam or her life before America. The fortune was not a blessing but a burden, soaked in grief and survivor's guilt so profound that touching it would have meant acknowledging that she had lived while everyone else had died. Victor Hale first appeared in David Zhang's office on a Thursday morning without an appointment, a tall man in his early 60s wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Samantha made in a month. David's receptionist tried to turn him away, but Victor had smiled with practiced charm and said he only needed 5 minutes to discuss a matter that would be of significant financial benefit to Miss Callahan, and his tone carried enough authority that the receptionist had reluctantly buzzed David's office. Samantha had been meeting with David to review their response to Derek and Victoria's motion when Victor was shown in, and he introduced himself with a firm handshake and a business card that identified him as the founder and CEO of Heritage Recovery International, a company that specialized in locating and recovering lost assets from historical conflicts and displaced populations. His voice was smooth and cultured, his manner pleasant and professional, and he explained that he had learned through certain channels, which he did not specify, that Samantha had come into possession of refugee assets from the fall of Saigon, and that he wanted to make her a very generous offer. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper, sliding it across David's desk toward Samantha. The number written on it was $50 million. Victor explained that his company had extensive experience in situations exactly like hers, that the process of properly authenticating, appraising, and liquidating refugee assets was extremely complex and time-consuming, that it could take years to realize the full value, and that in the meantime she would be facing legal challenges, security concerns, and enormous stress. He was prepared to offer her $50 million in cash, transferred to any account she specified within 48 hours, in exchange for everything in the metal box, no appraisals needed, no authentication required, no questions asked. It was, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the easiest money she would ever make, and it would allow her to move on with her life without the burden her grandmother had carried for 50 years. Samantha looked at David, who gave a subtle shake of his head, and she turned back to Victor and said quietly that she appreciated his offer but that the assets were not for sale. The change in Victor's demeanor was immediate and chilling. The pleasant smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cold calculation, and he leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He said that was unfortunate, that he hoped she understood she was making her situation far more difficult than it needed to be, and then he mentioned, in a tone of casual conversation, that he had noticed she worked at the Department of Family Services on 5th Street, that he had seen her walking from there to the subway station on 3rd Avenue most evenings around 6 o'clock, usually alone. He mentioned the name of her apartment building, the fact that it had no doorman, no security cameras, and that the lock on the front entrance was broken more often than it was fixed. He stood, smoothing his expensive suit, and said he hoped she would reconsider his offer before things became more complicated, and that she could reach him at the number on his card any time, day or night. Then he walked out, leaving his business card on the desk and a silence in the room that felt suffocating. David was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger, saying that Victor Hale was exactly the kind of predator who had built a fortune exploiting desperate refugees, and that they needed to take his threat seriously. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once, like a structure weakening under pressure until a single additional ounce of weight causes total collapse. It started 3 days after Victor Hale's visit when Samantha was in the middle of a case review meeting with her supervisor and 2 colleagues, discussing the placement of 3 siblings whose mother had relapsed, and a process server walked into the conference room holding a thick manila envelope with her name on it. He asked her to confirm her identity in front of everyone, handed her the papers, and walked out, leaving Samantha sitting at the table with her face burning with humiliation, as her supervisor gently suggested they take a break. The papers were an amended motion from Derek and Victoria, now claiming that Samantha had exerted undue influence over May in her final months, that she had manipulated a sick and confused old woman, and demanding that all assets be frozen immediately pending a full psychiatric evaluation of May's mental state at the time she wrote her letter. The accusations were lies, vicious and calculated, but they were now part of the public record, filed with the court, and Samantha knew her colleagues had seen the server, had wondered what legal trouble she was in. 2 nights later, she came home from an evening meeting with David to find her apartment door slightly ajar, the frame splintered near the lock where someone had forced it open. Her heart hammering, she called 911 and waited in the hallway until police arrived, and when they searched the apartment with her, they found nothing missing, nothing. Her laptop was still on the table, her small television untouched, the $20 in cash she kept in her desk drawer still there. But her closet had been opened, her drawers pulled out and left that way, and the message was unmistakably clear. We can get to you anytime we want. The harassment intensified after that. Her phone rang constantly with calls from blocked numbers, some offering to buy the stones for ridiculous lowball amounts, others simply playing recordings of screaming or threats before hanging up. Text messages arrived at all hours. You're going to lose everything. Just give it up before you get hurt. Your grandmother wouldn't want this for you. She changed her number twice. But within days the calls and texts would start again, and she realized someone was buying her new information each time. She stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, jerking awake at every sound in the building, checking the lock on her door obsessively, unable to eat more than a few bites at each meal because her stomach was knotted with constant anxiety. She lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, dark circles under her eyes so pronounced that her supervisor asked if she needed to take a leave of absence. The thought of giving it all away, of just handing the stones to Derek and Victoria, or selling them to Victor Hale for whatever he offered, became a constant temptation, a way to make the nightmare stop. On a cold Saturday morning, desperate and exhausted, Samantha drove to the cemetery where May had been buried just 6 weeks earlier. She found the grave still without a headstone, marked only by a temporary metal plate, and she sank to her knees in the damp grass and broke down completely. She cried until she had no tears left, her body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than grief, and she asked her grandmother why had May done this to her? Why had she left her this impossible burden when all Samantha had ever wanted was something simple to remember her by, something that wouldn't destroy her life? She stayed there for over an hour, alone among the silent stones, and when she finally stood to leave, she felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a bone-deep weariness. That night, unable to sleep once again, Samantha sat at her kitchen table with May's letter spread before her, reading it for perhaps the 100th time, searching for some answer, some guidance, some indication of what she was supposed to do with this impossible inheritance that was destroying her life. The paper was soft from repeated handling, the creases deep where she had folded and unfolded it, and she traced her grandmother's handwriting with one finger, trying to feel some connection to the woman who had written these words, knowing she would never see Samantha again. She read through the description of May's life in Saigon, the fall of the city, the loss of her family, the decades of silence and grief. And then she reached the final paragraph that she had memorized word for word. Use what is inside to build something that cannot be stolen, cannot be burned, cannot be lost to war or greed. But this time, as the light from her desk lamp hit the paper at a particular angle, she noticed something she had never seen before. There was a mark at the very bottom of the second page, below May's signature, a faint discoloration that was barely visible, like a water stain or a smudge. Samantha held the paper closer to the light, tilting it back and forth, and her breath caught as she realized it was not random. There were shapes, the ghost of letters, so faint they were almost invisible. Her mind raced, remembering something from childhood, from a book about spies or a science project. She couldn't recall exactly, but the memory was there. Invisible ink made from lemon juice that became visible when heated. Her hands were shaking as she stood and turned on her electric stove, setting the burner to low, and she held May's letter several inches above the heat, moving it slowly back and forth, terrified she would burn it but driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the faint marks began to darken, browning as the acid in the lemon juice oxidized from the heat, and words appeared like a ghost materializing from smoke. The message was in May's handwriting, smaller and more cramped than the visible letter, as if she had written it with great care and deliberation. The value is not in what you sell, but in what you build. Our family lost everything because of greed and war. Do not let greed win again. Build something that cannot be burned, cannot be stolen, cannot be lost. Build a future for others like us. Samantha read the words once, twice, 3 times, and with each reading she felt something shift inside her, the crushing weight of the burden transforming into something else entirely. May had not given her wealth to spend or hoard or fight over with her greedy siblings. May had given her a mission, a purpose, a way to transform 50 years of grief and survivor's guilt into something meaningful. The stones were not the inheritance. The inheritance was the responsibility to use them well, to build something that would honor not just May but all the people who had died, all the refugees who had lost everything, all the families torn apart by war and greed. Samantha sat back down at her table, the letter still in her hands, the hidden message now visible and impossible to unsee, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she knew exactly what she had to do. Her grandmother had carried this fortune in silence for 5 decades, had lived modestly and worked herself to exhaustion, not because she was afraid to use it, but because she was waiting for the right purpose, the right hands, the right moment. And she had chosen Samantha not because Samantha was weak or sentimental, but because May had known that Samantha would understand what Derek and Victoria never could. That true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the lives you could change, and the future you could build for those who had nothing. Samantha called the emergency meeting for a Tuesday morning at David Zhang's office, and she insisted through David that Derek and Victoria bring their attorney, Richard Morrison, and agree to the presence of a professional mediator, a former judge named Patricia Lawson who specialized in estate disputes. Derek and Victoria arrived 20 minutes late, clearly intending to make a power play, their faces set in expressions of smug anticipation, as if they expected Samantha to finally cave and hand over what they believed was rightfully theirs. They sat on one side of David's conference table, while Samantha sat on the other with David beside her, and Judge Lawson, a dignified woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, sat at the head. Richard Morrison opened his briefcase, clearly prepared to present yet another legal assault. But Samantha spoke first, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She said she had a proposal, and she wanted them to listen to the entire thing before responding. She explained that she had spent the past 3 weeks consulting with appraisers, estate specialists, and tax attorneys, and that the total value of May's hidden assets, once properly authenticated, appraised, and liquidated through legitimate channels, would likely be between $190 and $200 million before taxes, and approximately $180 to $185 million after all taxes and legal fees were paid. Derek and Victoria leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with greed, but Samantha continued without pausing. She proposed that the assets be liquidated properly and legally over the next 12 to 18 months, and that the proceeds be placed in a newly established foundation called the May Nguyen Foundation for Refugee Services, dedicated to providing legal aid, housing assistance, education, job training, and trauma counseling for refugees and asylum seekers. The foundation would be professionally managed by a board of directors that would include refugee advocates, mental health professionals, and community leaders, and it would operate in perpetuity, helping thousands of families build new lives in America. In exchange for Derek and Victoria immediately dropping all legal claims, withdrawing their motions, and signing releases stating they had no further interest in May's estate, Samantha proposed that each of them receive $5 million in cash, paid within 60 days of the settlement agreement being finalized. The room exploded. Victoria shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage, screaming that Samantha was insane, that she was throwing away a fortune on people who meant nothing, that May would never have wanted her hard-earned wealth given away to strangers. Derek's voice was colder but equally furious, saying that Samantha had clearly lost her mind, that he would never agree to this ridiculous proposal, that they would fight her until she had nothing left. Richard Morrison tried to calm his clients, but they ignored him, Victoria's voice rising to a shriek as she called Samantha selfish and delusional, said that $10 million combined was an insult when they deserved at least half of everything. Judge Lawson rapped her knuckles sharply on the table, demanding silence, and David Zhang stood, his voice cutting through the chaos with the calm authority of someone presenting irrefutable facts. He explained that if Derek and Victoria continued their legal challenge, they would be entering a battle that could last 3 to 5 years, that estate litigation of this complexity and value would cost each side at minimum $5 to $7 million in legal fees, expert witnesses, appraisals, and court costs, and that there was no guarantee they would win. He pointed out that May's letter, combined with the clear designation in the will, gave Samantha an extremely strong legal position, and that a judge might very well rule that the siblings had no claim whatsoever to assets that were specifically hidden and designated for Samantha alone, which would leave them with nothing except crushing legal debt. Victor Hale did not accept defeat gracefully, and when he learned through his sources that Samantha had proposed creating a foundation rather than selling the assets to him, he understood that she was not like the other desperate refugees and their descendants he had dealt with over his long career of acquiring lost treasures. She was principled, which made her unpredictable, and unpredictable people were dangerous to his business model. He made a call to a private investigator he had used many times before, a former police detective named Carl Russo who specialized in deep background checks and had access to databases most people didn't know existed. Victor gave him Samantha's name, her address, her place of employment, and a single instruction: find everything, every vulnerability, every secret, anything that could be used to pressure her or discredit her in court. Carl Russo was thorough and efficient, and within a week he delivered a file that was surprisingly thick for someone who was only 30 years old and had lived what appeared from the outside to be a quiet, unremarkable life. The file painted a picture of profound tragedy and resilience. Samantha Marie Callahan had been born to May's daughter, Jennifer Nguyen, who had been the troubled child in a family of high achievers, the one who had struggled with addiction from her teenage years and had never managed to build a stable life. Samantha's father, whose name appeared on the birth certificate as Thomas Callahan, had left when Samantha was 2 years old and had never been heard from again. No child support, no contact, simply vanishing, as if his daughter had never existed. Jennifer had done her best for 6 years, cycling through rehab programs and low-wage jobs, but when Samantha was 8, Jennifer had died of a heroin overdose in a motel room while Samantha was at school. May had taken her granddaughter in without hesitation, had raised her alone because May's son, Derek, and Victoria's father, had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with his sister's junkie kid. The file included school records showing that Samantha had been an excellent student despite her traumatic childhood, had earned scholarships to college and graduate school, and had deliberately chosen a career in social work despite knowing it would never make her wealthy. But what caught Victor's attention most, what made him sit back in his chair and reassess everything, were the financial records Carl had managed to obtain through methods Victor didn't ask about. Samantha's bank statements showed a pattern that had been consistent for the past 5 years. Every month, sometimes twice a month, she made small cash withdrawals of $50 or $100, and alongside those withdrawals were notations in a small ledger Carl had photographed from her apartment during a carefully timed entry when she was at work. The notations were names, mostly Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern, and beside each name was a brief note. Rent assistance, winter coats for kids, ESL textbooks, immigration filing fee. Carl had cross-referenced several of the names and found that they were all refugee families Samantha had worked with through her job, families she was helping with her own money she could barely afford to give away. The investigator's final report included a psychological assessment based on all the information gathered, and the conclusion was stark. Subject demonstrates exceptional strength of character, deep commitment to principles over self-interest, and appears incorruptible through standard leverage methods. No evidence of vices, debts, or compromising relationships that could be exploited. Victor Hale read the report twice and understood that Samantha Callahan was exactly the kind of person who could not be bought, threatened, or manipulated into doing what was convenient for him, which made her more than an obstacle. It made her a genuine threat to everything he wanted. Victoria Callahan Pierce had always been the smart one, the calculating one, the daughter who had inherited her father's business acumen and her mother's social grace, and she had built a successful career in pharmaceutical sales through a combination of charm and ruthless determination. But as the legal battle with Samantha dragged on and the proposed settlement loomed, she felt control slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers, and desperation drove her to a decision that would ultimately destroy what remained of her credibility. She spent 3 sleepless nights researching May's handwriting, studying photographs of her grandmother's letters and notes, practicing the careful script with its slightly formal English and precise letter formations. She purchased what she thought was appropriate stationery from an office supply store, aged the paper with tea and careful exposure to sunlight, and composed what she believed was a convincing letter dated 2 months after the original, in which May supposedly expressed regret for her earlier decision and stated that she wanted all assets divided equally among her 3 grandchildren, because family unity was more important than individual preference. The forgery was ambitious and detailed, including references to conversations Victoria claimed had happened, expressions of concern about fairness, and a closing statement that Victoria thought was particularly clever. "I cannot let my love for one grandchild blind me to what is right for all." She presented the forged letter to Richard Morrison with tears in her eyes, claiming she had just found it among some papers May had given her years ago and had forgotten about until now, and Morrison, who should have known better but was blinded by the potential fees from an extended legal battle, filed it with the court as newly discovered evidence. David Zhang received a copy of the filing on a Friday afternoon, and the moment he read the supposed letter, every instinct he had developed over 20 years of practice told him something was wrong. The language was too contemporary, too convenient, too perfectly designed to undermine Samantha's claim, and the timing of its sudden discovery after weeks of contentious litigation was suspicious. He immediately contacted a forensic document examiner named Dr. Patricia Chen, a woman who had testified in dozens of high-profile cases and whose laboratory could analyze everything from ink composition to paper manufacturing dates. Dr. Chen took the original letter that Victoria had submitted to the court and spent 3 days subjecting it to every test available. Spectroscopic analysis of the ink, microscopic examination of the paper fibers, chemical testing of the artificial aging, and comparison of the handwriting to known samples of May's script. Her report, delivered to David's office along with the physical letter sealed in an evidence bag, was devastating in its clarity. The paper, despite Victoria's attempts to age it, was manufactured by a company that had only started producing that particular weight and texture in 2023. 3 years after May's death in 2020, the ink was a modern, gel-based formula that had not existed in the form used until 2022, and the artificial aging through tea staining was visible under ultraviolet light as an inconsistent pattern that no genuine aged document would display. Most damning of all, the handwriting analysis showed numerous deviations from May's authentic script, including letter formations that were close but not quite right, pressure patterns that were inconsistent with May's arthritis-affected writing in her final years, and a fluidity that suggested someone writing slowly and carefully rather than naturally. David called an emergency meeting at his office the following Monday, and this time he requested only Victoria, her attorney Richard Morrison, and Judge Lawson as witness. When Victoria arrived, confident and composed in her expensive suit, David did not waste time on pleasantries. He placed Dr. Chen's report on the table in front of her, along with enlarged photographs showing the paper's manufacturing watermark dated 2023 and the UV light images revealing the artificial tea staining. He explained in calm, precise language that Victoria had committed forgery and fraud, both serious crimes that carried potential prison sentences of up to 5 years, and that he had already consulted with the district attorney's office about filing criminal charges. Victoria's face went white, then red, her composure shattering as she looked at the evidence and realized how completely her plan had failed. Richard Morrison, understanding immediately that his client had lied to him and made him an unwitting participant in a crime, began distancing himself with professional language about being deceived and needing to withdraw from representation. David continued, his voice never rising but carrying absolute authority, saying that he was prepared to file a criminal complaint that afternoon unless Victoria immediately and irrevocably withdrew from all legal proceedings related to May's estate, signed a binding agreement admitting her forgery attempt, and agreed never to contest any aspect of Samantha's inheritance again. Victoria tried to argue, her voice breaking, saying it was a mistake, saying she had been desperate, but Judge Lawson cut her off with a cold statement that forgery was not a mistake but a deliberate criminal act, and that Victoria should be grateful David was offering her a way to avoid prosecution. The signing took less than 10 minutes, Victoria's hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, and when it was done, she stood and walked out of the office with tears streaming down her face. Tears not of remorse but of pure rage and humiliation, knowing that she had destroyed any remaining credibility she had and that her attempt to steal what she believed was rightfully hers had cost her everything. Derek Callahan sat alone in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the investment bank where he was a senior partner. The city lights spread below him like a carpet of diamonds, and it was past 11 at night on a Thursday, when he should have been home with his wife and 2 children, but instead was reviewing financial projections that suddenly seemed meaningless. The forgery scandal had broken that afternoon. Victoria's humiliation splashed across family text messages and whispered phone calls, and while Derek had not been involved in her criminal stupidity, he felt the weight of it pressing on him, the recognition that their family had descended into something ugly and grasping. He was staring at his computer screen without seeing it, when his assistant's voice came through the intercom, startling him, saying that an elderly woman was in the lobby insisting she needed to speak with him and refusing to leave until she did. Derek's first instinct was to have security remove her, but something in his assistant's tone suggested this was not a typical situation, so he told her to send the woman up. Mrs. Chen stepped off the elevator 5 minutes later, a small, dignified figure in a simple coat, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, and Derek barely recognized her as the woman who had lived next door to his grandmother for decades, someone he had seen perhaps a dozen times at family gatherings and had never bothered to really notice. She walked into his office without invitation, sat down in the chair across from his massive desk, and looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no judgment, only a profound sadness that made Derek deeply uncomfortable. She began to speak, her voice quiet but carrying a strength that filled the room, and she told him a story he had never heard because he had never bothered to ask. She described May arriving in America in 1975, a 17-year-old girl who spoke almost no English and who cried every single night for the first 3 years, the sound of her grief carrying through the thin walls of the refugee housing where they had both lived. She described watching May work 3 jobs simultaneously, sewing in a factory during the day, cleaning offices at night, and taking in alterations on weekends, her hands moving constantly, bleeding from needle pricks and developing permanent calluses and scars that Derek had noticed as a child but had never questioned. Mrs. Chen explained that May had sent money to her son, Derek's father, to help him through college and medical school, had paid for his wedding, had given him the down payment for his first house, and had done it all while living in a tiny apartment and eating rice and vegetables because meat was too expensive. She described May's children, including Derek's father, growing distant as they became successful, ashamed of their immigrant mother with her accented English and her modest clothes, visiting less and less frequently, calling only when they needed money or help. She described watching May continue to sew for other people even as she aged and her hands became arthritic and painful because she could never stop working, could never rest, could never spend a penny on herself, because spending money felt like betraying the family she had lost. Mrs. Chen's voice never rose, never accused, but every word landed on Derek like a physical blow, stripping away the comfortable narrative he had built about his grandmother being a simple old woman who had happened to hide a fortune. May had been a human being who had suffered more than Derek could imagine, who had sacrificed everything for children and grandchildren who had taken her for granted, and who had chosen Samantha not out of favoritism, but out of recognition that Samantha alone had truly seen her and loved her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Derek felt something break inside him, a dam of grief and shame that he had been holding back for weeks, and he put his face in his hands and wept like he had not wept since he was a child. The sobs came from somewhere deep and raw, and Mrs. Chen sat silently across from him, bearing witness to his breakdown without offering comfort, because comfort would have been a lie. When Derek finally raised his head, his face wet with tears and his expensive suit rumpled, he reached for his phone with shaking hands and called Samantha. She answered cautiously, her voice tight with exhaustion, and Derek said simply that he was sorry, that he had been wrong about everything, that he was withdrawing his legal challenge immediately, and that she should do with May's legacy whatever she thought was right. Samantha started to mention the $5 million settlement, but Derek cut her off, his voice thick with emotion, saying he didn't want the money, didn't deserve it, and that he just wanted to be left alone with his shame and the memory of a grandmother he had failed to honor while she was alive. 6 months after the legal battle had finally ended with Victoria's disgrace and Derek's withdrawal, David Zhang called Samantha to his office for what he said would be the final meeting regarding the estate evaluation, and his tone carried a weight that told her this was the culmination of everything they had been working toward. She arrived on a cold March morning to find David's conference room transformed into something resembling a secure vault, with 3 different appraisal experts present: Dr. Samuel Katz, who had evaluated that first diamond, a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, who specialized in colored gemstones, and a thin, serious man named Robert Martinez, who dealt in international property and historical financial instruments. David began the presentation with the methodical precision that had characterized all his work, explaining that every stone had been individually certified by the Gemological Institute of America, that the bonds had been authenticated through archives in France and Switzerland, and that the property deed had been verified through official channels in Vietnam. The diamonds, he explained, had been the most complex part of the evaluation because they were all uncut, requiring expert assessment of what they would yield once properly cut and polished by master craftsmen. Dr. Katz had worked with a team in Antwerp, the diamond capital of the world, and they had determined that the rough stones would produce approximately 143 individual cut diamonds, ranging from 1 carat to 12 carats, with a combined certified value of $87 million. The colored stones, evaluated by Dr. Chen, included rubies from Burma that were now essentially impossible to obtain due to international sanctions, sapphires from Ceylon of a quality rarely seen in modern markets, and emeralds that had originated in Colombia in the 1,960 seconds before the mines had been depleted, with a total appraised value of $24 million. Robert Martinez then presented his findings on the bonds and property, and this was where Samantha's mind began to struggle with the numbers being discussed as if they were abstractions rather than real money. The bonds, issued by French colonial companies and backed by the French government, had been assumed worthless after the fall of Indochina, but Martinez had discovered through painstaking research that the French government had established a reconciliation fund in the 1,990 seconds to honor certain pre-war debts, and May's bonds qualified under obscure provision that had never been widely publicized. With accumulated interest calculated at the rates specified in the original instruments, compounded over 50 years, the bonds were worth $31 million. The property deed for the building on Dong Khoi Street in what was now District 1 of Ho Chi Minh City had required extensive negotiation with Vietnamese authorities, but Martinez had managed to establish clear title, and the property, located in what had become the most expensive commercial real estate in Vietnam, was conservatively valued at $63 million. David paused, letting these numbers settle, and then he walked Samantha through the final calculations. The total gross value was $205 million, from which they had to deduct federal estate taxes, state taxes, capital gains taxes on the property, legal fees, appraisal costs, and various other expenses that came to approximately $7 million, leaving a net total of $198 million. The number hung in the air of the conference room, impossible and real at the same time, and Samantha sat in stunned silence while the experts quietly gathered their materials and left, giving her privacy to process what she had just learned. David sat across from her, waiting patiently, and finally Samantha spoke, her voice barely a whisper, saying that her grandmother had sewn dresses for $15 each, had hemmed pants for $5, had worked until her fingers bled and her back was permanently bent, living in a house worth maybe $150,000, eating meals that probably cost $2 to prepare, never buying herself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, never taking a vacation, never spending money on anything except the bare necessities and gifts for her grandchildren. May had sat on a fortune that could have bought her comfort, security, leisure, and instead she had chosen to live as if she had nothing, had carried the weight of those stones and bonds and deeds for 50 years without ever breathing a word to anyone. And now that burden had been transformed into a number so large Samantha could barely comprehend it. 1 year and 3 months after Samantha had first opened that hidden compartment in her grandmother's sewing machine, she stood in the lobby of a building that had been transformed from a derelict community center into something beautiful and purposeful, watching as nearly 200 people filled the space for the May Nguyen Foundation's official opening ceremony. The building was located in the same neighborhood where May had first settled when she arrived in America in 1975, a working-class area that had absorbed wave after wave of immigrants and refugees over the decades, and Samantha had chosen this location deliberately because May had walked these streets, had shopped in these stores, had built her first American life in the shadow of these buildings. The renovation had taken 8 months and cost $3 million, and the result was a bright, welcoming space with large windows that let in floods of natural light, comfortable furniture in warm colors, and signs in a dozen languages directing people to different services. Samantha, wearing a simple navy dress that May would have approved of, stood near the entrance greeting arrivals, and she had assembled a board of directors that represented the best of what she hoped the foundation would become. Dr. An Tran, a trauma counselor who had fled Vietnam as a boat person in 1980, Omar Hassan, a Somali refugee who now ran a successful job training nonprofit, Maria Santos, an immigration attorney who had spent 20 years providing pro bono services, and 6 others whose lives had been shaped by displacement and who understood viscerally what the Foundation's clients would be experiencing. The ceremony began at 10 in the morning with remarks from the mayor, who praised Samantha's vision and spoke about the city's proud tradition of welcoming refugees, though Samantha noticed he carefully avoided mentioning the actual dollar amount of the Foundation's endowment. David Zhang spoke next, his voice carrying the emotion of someone who had been part of this journey from the beginning, explaining that the Foundation would provide comprehensive services, including free legal representation for asylum seekers, navigating the complex immigration system, English language classes taught by certified instructors, job training programs in partnership with local businesses, emergency housing assistance for families in crisis, and crucially, trauma-informed mental health counseling, provided by therapists who understood the specific psychological wounds of displacement and loss. When it was Samantha's turn to speak, she walked to the podium that had been set up in the main hall and looked out at the faces gathered before her. Refugee families who had already begun using the Foundation's services during its soft launch phase, community leaders, reporters from local news outlets, and in the front row, Mrs. Chen, who sat with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Samantha spoke for 10 minutes, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, And she told May's story not as a tale of hidden treasure but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, describing a 17-year-old girl who had lost everything but had never lost her sense of purpose, who had carried an impossible burden in silence, and who had ultimately transformed her grief into a gift for thousands of people she would never meet. She explained that the Foundation's endowment of $198 million would be carefully managed to provide services in perpetuity, that the initial year's operating budget of $8 million would serve an estimated 1,500 families, and that the Foundation planned to expand to 3 additional cities within 5 years. After the speeches ended and the ribbon was cut, people moved through the building exploring the bright classrooms where English would be taught, the private offices where lawyers would meet with clients, the community kitchen where families could gather for shared meals, and the children's area filled with books and toys, where kids could play while their parents attended classes or counseling sessions. But most people eventually made their way to the lobby, drawn by what hung on the wall facing the entrance. A large, professionally restored photograph of May Nguyen at age 16, taken in Saigon in 1974, showing a beautiful young woman in a traditional ao dai, her hair long and dark, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who had no idea what the future held. Beneath the photograph, mounted in a climate-controlled glass case with soft interior lighting, sat the Singer sewing machine, its black iron and worn wood polished but not refinished, left exactly as May had kept it, and a small brass plaque explained its significance as the vessel that had carried a fortune across an ocean and through half a century, a symbol of how strength and resilience could be hidden in the most ordinary of objects, waiting for the right moment and the right hands to transform suffering into hope. Victor Hale watched the news coverage of the May Nguyen Foundation's opening with a rage that bordered on obsession. Sitting in his pristine office surrounded by artifacts he had acquired over decades from desperate refugees who had sold family treasures for a fraction of their value. And he understood that Samantha Callahan had not just refused his offer, but had created something that threatened the very foundation of his business model. If other refugees and their descendants saw what Samantha had done, saw that it was possible to hold on to their heritage and use it for good rather than selling it to men like him, his entire enterprise would be in jeopardy. He made a decision born of desperation and spite, reaching out to contacts he had cultivated at several major media outlets, offering them what he called an explosive story about hidden treasure and international intrigue. Within a week, a reporter from a sensationalist news website published an article with the headline "Vietnamese Treasure Hoard, Stolen Riches or Legitimate Inheritance." And the piece, clearly fed information by Victor, suggested that May Nguyen might have smuggled stolen property out of Vietnam, that the gems could have been looted from museums or wealthy families during the chaos of the fall of Saigon, and that the Vietnamese government had never been properly notified of their existence and might have a legitimate claim to recover what was rightfully national patrimony. The article included quotes from Victor, identified as an expert in refugee asset recovery, saying that many fortunes brought out of Vietnam were ill-gotten and that proper due diligence required investigation into the provenance of such extraordinary wealth. The story was picked up by 2 other outlets, and suddenly Samantha found herself fielding calls from reporters asking if she had stolen property, if she was profiting from looted treasures, if the foundation was built on a criminal enterprise. David Zhang's response was swift and devastating. He had anticipated that someone might eventually challenge the legitimacy of May's assets, and he had spent months working with researchers in both the United States and Vietnam to assemble an airtight chain of provenance. He held a press conference at his office, attended by a dozen journalists, and methodically presented the evidence. Original business licenses from the South Vietnamese government showing Nguyen Van Thu's gem merchant operation dating back to 1952. Shipping manifests from legitimate mining operations in Burma and Cambodia. Sales receipts from transactions with French colonial officials and Vietnamese families, and even photographs from Saigon newspapers showing Nguyen Van Thu at legitimate business and social functions. Most damning to Victor's claims were letters from the Vietnamese government's own Ministry of Culture, obtained through official diplomatic channels, stating that they had reviewed the documentation and confirmed that the Nguyen family's gem business had been entirely legitimate and that they had no interest in claiming the assets. David then did something Victor had not anticipated. He pivoted from defense to offense. He announced that his investigation into Victor Hale's background had revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 3 decades, and he released a detailed report compiled by a team of investigative journalists he had quietly hired. The report documented case after case of Victor approaching refugee families, offering them pennies on the dollar for precious heirlooms and assets, using scare tactics about government seizure or legal complications, and then reselling those items for 10 or 20 times what he had paid. There were interviews with elderly Cambodian refugees who had sold him ancient temple artifacts for a few $1,000s that Victor had then sold to museums for hundreds of thousands. There were Vietnamese families who had given him their grandparents' jade collections for almost nothing, Syrian refugees who had sold him rare manuscripts under duress, and a Somali family who had been forced to sell their great-grandmother's gold wedding jewelry to Victor for $500 when they were facing eviction, jewelry Victor had later sold at auction for $38,000. The media, always eager for a story about the powerful exploiting the vulnerable, turned on Victor with the same enthusiasm they had initially shown for his allegations against Samantha. Within days, 3 major newspapers published investigative pieces about his business practices, and within 2 weeks, a law firm specializing in class action suits announced they were filing a lawsuit on behalf of 17 refugee families. Victor had cheated over the years, seeking damages and the return of items that had been sold under duress. Victor's reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, collapsed in a matter of weeks, and Heritage Recovery International, his company, saw its client base evaporate as collectors and museums quietly distanced themselves from someone now publicly exposed as having built his fortune on the desperation of the world's most vulnerable people. On a sunny Saturday in June, exactly 1 year and 9 months after May's death, and on what would have been her 85th birthday, Samantha stood at her grandmother's grave holding a bouquet of jasmine flowers, May's favorite, and watched as Derek walked slowly up the path toward her, his hands in his pockets, and his face carrying an expression of profound humility that was so different from the arrogant rage she remembered from that terrible confrontation in her apartment. Derek looked different in other ways, too. He had lost weight, not in the unhealthy way Samantha had during her darkest days, but in a way that suggested he was taking better care of himself, and his expensive suit had been replaced by simple jeans and a button-down shirt. He stopped a few feet away, uncertain of his welcome, and Samantha gestured for him to come closer, and together they stood before the headstone that had finally been installed. A simple granite marker that read May Nguyen, 1940 to 2020. Beloved grandmother, she carried love across an ocean. Derek spoke first, his voice quiet and sincere, telling Samantha that he had been attending therapy twice a week for the past 8 months, working through issues he should have addressed years ago, and that his therapist had helped him understand that his obsession with money and status had been a way of avoiding the grief and inadequacy he had felt his entire life. He told her that he had been volunteering at the foundation for the past 3 months, teaching financial literacy classes to newly arrived refugee families, and that working with people who had lost everything had given him a perspective he had never had before. He said he had been sober for 8 months, that he had finally admitted to himself and his family that he had been using alcohol to numb feelings he didn't want to face, and that he was trying, every single day, to become the grandson May had deserved rather than the greedy, entitled man he had been. Samantha listened, and when Derek finished speaking, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently, and she told him that May would have been proud of the work he was doing. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Samantha pulled an envelope from her purse, explaining that it had arrived 2 days ago from Oregon. It was from Victoria, her handwriting on the envelope, and inside was a 2-page letter written in Victoria's precise script. Samantha read it aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion in the words. Victoria wrote that she was living in Portland, working as a sales associate in a small boutique, a far cry from her previous career, and that she was ashamed of what she had done, ashamed of the forgery, ashamed of her greed, ashamed of how she had treated both Samantha and May's memory. She wrote that she was not ready to face Samantha in person, that the shame was still too raw, but that she wanted Samantha to know that she understood now what she had been too blind to see before. That May's greatest gift had not been the fortune but the example of how to live with grace and purpose despite suffering. Victoria asked for forgiveness but said she would understand if Samantha could not give it. When Samantha finished reading, she folded the letter carefully and placed it on May's grave along with the jasmine flowers, and she spoke to her grandmother as if May could hear her, saying that forgiveness, like the fortune May had left, must be given freely to have meaning, and that she forgave both Derek and Victoria because holding on to anger would dishonor everything May had tried to teach her about transforming pain into purpose. 5 years after the May Nguyen Foundation opened its doors, Samantha stood in the lobby of the organization's new national headquarters, a 4-story building in the heart of the city that had been purchased and renovated to accommodate the foundation's explosive growth, and she placed her hand gently on the curve of her belly where her daughter was growing. A child who would be born in 3 months and would carry the name May Nguyen Jung, a bridge between generations and a living testament to her great-grandmother's legacy. The foundation had exceeded even David's most optimistic projections, having successfully helped over 3,000 refugee families navigate the complex process of resettlement, providing them with legal representation that had resulted in a 93% success rate in asylum cases, English language instruction that had enabled hundreds of adults to find meaningful employment, job training programs that had placed clients in careers ranging from healthcare to technology, and trauma counseling that had helped children and adults begin to heal from the wounds of displacement and loss. The foundation now operated branches in 3 cities, the original location in the neighborhood where May had first settled, a second facility in Houston serving refugees from Central America and the Middle East, and a third in Minneapolis working primarily with families from East Africa and Afghanistan. The organization had become a national model, with representatives from other cities regularly visiting to study their programs, and Samantha had testified before Congress twice about the importance of comprehensive refugee support services. She had stepped back from day-to-day operations 6 months ago as her pregnancy progressed, but she remained the foundation's director and the public face of May's legacy. David stood beside her now, her husband of 2 years, the man who had believed in her when she had been terrified and alone, and together they looked at the centerpiece of the lobby. May's Singer sewing machine, mounted in a larger, more elaborate glass case than the one in the original location, with museum-quality lighting and climate control to preserve it for generations to come. The machine sat on a rotating platform, allowing visitors to see it from all angles, and surrounding the case were photographs that told May's story. The formal portrait from Saigon, showing a beautiful young woman full of hope, the grainy refugee processing photo showing that same woman hollowed out by grief, pictures of May in her small house sewing for her customers, and finally, a photo of May at 80 holding Samantha's hand at a holiday dinner, her face lined with age but her eyes still sharp and knowing. A plaque beneath the case, written in English, Spanish, Arabic, Somali, and Vietnamese, read, "This sewing machine carried a fortune across an ocean and through 50 years of silence." It represents the hidden strength of refugees everywhere, who carry their losses and their hopes in equal measure, and who build new lives from the fragments of old ones. May Nguyen guarded her father's legacy not for herself but for a purpose she would not live to see, the transformation of private grief into public good, of suffering into service, of fear into hope. Samantha placed her hand on the glass case, feeling the slight warmth from the interior lights, and she whispered a promise that only David could hear, saying that their daughter would grow up knowing her great-grandmother's story, would understand that the treasure May had protected was never really about the diamonds or the bonds or the property, but about the recognition that wealth without purpose is meaningless, that privilege carries responsibility, and that the most valuable inheritance is not what you receive but what you choose to do with it. The fortune that May had guarded in silence for 50 years was now speaking loudly for those who had no voice, and it would continue speaking long after Samantha herself was gone, a perpetual gift that transformed the suffering of one family into hope for thousands.